In the name of the Father, and of the Son, and of the Holy Spirit. Before I begin, I just want you to know there's nothing more powerful than a room full of believers singing something like Amazing Grace. You all sounded great, and Robert's going to sign every one of you up for choir. I'm going to start with 3 introductory points. The first is that Helmut Kester, who was a longtime professor of New Testament at Harvard Divinity School and was one of my professors, he always said that a parable is about the first person who is mentioned. And in today's parable, it starts out, there was a man who had 2 sons. Second introductory point. This is an outlandish story of grace and forgiveness. Outlandish, meaning looking and sounding bizarre, unfamiliar, weird, outside the boundaries of normal behavior. And then the third introductory point is the word prodigal. I can't paraphrase his accent, but to paraphrase Inigo Montoya, you keep saying that word, I don't think it means what you think it means. For those of you who don't know what that's about, ask your children. And we'll come back to that later. This is a man who happens to have 2 sons. It's a story about the father and his outlandish behavior, which is characterized by grace and forgiveness. The kind of grace and forgiveness that offends us. Frederick Buechner wrote that grace is something that you can never get. It can only be given. You can't earn it. You can't deserve it. Somebody loving us is grace. Loving somebody is grace. Have you ever tried to love someone? There's only one catch to grace. Like any other gift, the gift of grace can only be yours if you reach out and take it. Forgiveness. To forgive someone says something like this: you've done something unspeakable. I should call it quits between us. But I refuse to let it stand between us. I still want to be your friend. To accept forgiveness is admitting I did something unspeakable that needs to be forgiven. And it requires that both parties swallow the exact same thing, and that is their pride. Forgiveness that's conditional isn't forgiveness, it's just fair warning. Our unforgiveness is one of those things we need to have God forgive us for. And the pride that keeps us from forgiving is the same pride which keeps us from accepting forgiveness. Now, our story today is a parable. Every parable is a story which opens a window into a larger, deeper meaning. We have to understand these stories as Jesus' listeners would have understood them, because these are stories about Israel and about the kingdom of God. Jesus uses this imagery to reveal the heart of God. But the parables don't only point to God, they also point to Jesus' ministry in Israel. So in the father of these two sons, we see the work of God and the work of Jesus. If you take the father out of the parable, the story disintegrates. Every parable is also about the outlandishness of God, who will do impossible things with impossible people. And we've got multiple levels of outlandishness today. Fast forward, the younger son's gone. He's blown it all. In our story, there is no indication that he realizes that he's made a jack-you-know-what out of himself. No indication that he knows he broke his father's heart by asking for his share. There's no indication he thinks his old man is anything other than a meal ticket. There is no sign that he's sorry, really sorry. There's no sign that he's resolved to make amends. He decides to go home because he knows that he's going to get 3 squares when he gets there. So just imagine. He's out there with the pigs, and he's rehearsing his speech. Kind of the same way many of us in this congregation did years ago when we knew we had to go tell mom or dad that we did something. And some of the people in this congregation probably are doing this even as we speak. Okay, if I say it this way, no, if I look at that, if I hold my head down. The young man rehearses his speech. He wants that inflection and those gestures to be correct. And just when he thinks he's got it right, what happens? His old man comes running down the road like a maniac. This father with these 2 sons runs out. Some of the most striking images in the Bible are people running. Matthew, Luke, John, in the resurrection story, at almost the opening verse, they talk about the disciples running. Paul wrote to the Corinthians about running the race. In Exodus, we hear about the Israelites running amok with Aaron. And in 2 Samuel, we hear about the runners coming into David, whether it's to tell him that Uriah is dead or whether it's to tell him that his son Absalom is dead. And later this year, we're going to hear about little old Zacchaeus, who goes running down the road to climb a tree so he can see Jesus. Okay, today we run to go catch the train. You know, it's pulling out of North Station and you really want to get back here, and there you are running down trying to grab the rail so you can hop onto the train. Well, in Jesus' world, the more senior you were, the less likely it was that you would be running or even walking fast. Because you see, that showed a lack of dignity, a lack of gravitas. It was outlandish. But here we've got Jesus telling us a story about a man who's running, a story that's supposed to be a window into the nature of God. His telling that story 2,000 years ago would have the same effect if I were to stand here and tell you a story about Queen Elizabeth running to greet the Prime Minister when he or she arrives for their weekly meeting. It's inconceivable. And the reason this father is running is equally outlandish. He's running to greet someone, to welcome him back into the fold. We need the Father's outlandishness because we've forgotten about forgiveness. or we've trivialized it. We're really good in the 21st century with replacing morality with that phrase, well, if it feels good, do it. And that leaves us at a place where there's nothing to forgive anymore. So if I say I'm going to pull out a gun and shoot Tom Bedard because it feels good, poor Tom, but what's to forgive? It felt right, felt good for me. We live in a time where if you still feel hurt by something, you retreat into a private world, a world that's filled with like-minded people, and then pretend that whatever it was never happened, was never said, etc. In that sort of world, you don't need God to forgive you, and you don't need to forgive anyone else. And that brings us into a world where even if we did think about forgiveness, it's usually about the little things. I bumped into you. Oh, I'm sorry. My bad. Which really is not a phrase that leads to forgiveness. We also live in a world where instead of forgiveness, we live with a vague notion of tolerance. At best, tolerance is a low-grade parody of forgiveness. It's a caricature. At its worst, tolerance is just sweeping the real issues of human life under the carpet. The young son is back. The father doesn't do what we would assume a father would do. He doesn't run out there saying, well, I certainly hope he learned his lesson. No, the father runs out and greets him and says, for God's sake, get him a coat, get him a ring, get him jewelry, get the food, let's have a party. So they bring out the band, the single malt, the neighbors, and they have the biggest party you ever wanted to see. We have to hear the gospel as wild and as outlandish as all that just sounded. Indeed, we have to hear the gospel as comedy, if we're going to hear it at all. Anything else, when we take any gospel lesson and we put it in a box and we tie a bow on the top and we present it in a very neat package, well, that's when the gospel becomes the church's thing or the preacher's thing, but it's not God's thing. It is only when we hear the gospel as outlandish, indeed at times as comedy, ringing with laughter, that's when we're hearing God. If the father intended to only tolerate the younger son, he wouldn't have been running down that road. No, he wanted a relationship with him. He's offering forgiveness because forgiveness is richer and harder and deeper and more outlandish than what we usually think. Jesus tells this story to emphasize what real forgiveness is. And he's insisting that you and I don't settle for any man-made substitutes to the kind of forgiveness that God offers. That's the real deal about the outlandishness of God. But, we can be equally outlandish, especially in our sin. Now, sin may be too grand a word to apply to the older son and his reaction, but it really does seem kind of appropriate, because in that older son, we find the outlandishness of the deadly sins. Envy, pride, anger, covetousness, sloth, sitting on his patrimony, letting it gain interest, and lust, consumed with the idea that his younger brother had wasted everything with prostitutes. The older brother comes off a bit like Shakespeare's Iago, or what Mark Twain once called a good man in the worst sense of the word. A caricature of all that is joyless, petty, self-serving. And in that sense, he's a caricature of you and me. So where's this outlandish thing? What comedy is there in the encounter between the father and the older son? The outlandish thing is the father loves him. Always has and always will. But the older son can't see that because it never was love that he wanted. He only wanted what was due him. The party, the single malt, the band, that could have been his if he had asked. But he never thought to ask because he was too busy trying to earn it. And so, now we come to that word prodigal. As Inigo said, you keep using this word, but I don't think you know what it means. Or in our case, to whom it applies. Now, just to refresh your memory, it's both an adjective and a noun. As an adjective, it means spending money and resources freely and recklessly, outlandishly. As a noun, it refers to a person who spends in a reckless, extravagant, outlandish way. The prodigal in this story is the father, who is recklessly, excessively, outlandishly bestowing grace and forgiveness on his children. The grace that offends our humanly limited senses of fairness, and the forgiveness which we human beings want to reduce to just condoning. The Father offers grace and forgiveness in abundance. And Jesus is telling this story of grace and forgiveness for a reason, because this is the nature of God's rule. This is who God is. God was liberating Israel from her slavery. He was setting the whole world, the whole family of God, to rights. The crowd to whom Jesus was speaking wanted an end to oppression and exile. They wanted it politically, socially, culturally, economically. But according to the prophets, the oppression and the exile were the result of Israel's sin. If Israel was to be freed from oppression and exile, it would come through the forgiveness of sins and the grace of God. When folks are in prison, they want freedom for many reasons. But if I went to a prison, if I went to MCI Concord and opened the gates and let everybody out, they would know quite clearly they had been forgiven. If you think that idea is outlandish, then think about the man running down the road to greet his disgraced son, and then going out in grace to his older son. Now that man is the prodigal. Amen.